there are lots of intersecting issues in this area. And I just wanted to draw on a couple of examples before I come on to say why the Refugee Convention doesn't really help us, to kind of illustrate how it can. Because it's wrong to say that someone who is displaced from their country of origin and part of that relates to climate will not achieve protection. It's just more complicated. There's an intersectionality in relation to the reasons why people move. I think in lots of different cases, it's not a single identifiable factor, that's particularly so in the context of climate. What I thought was easier to do rather than explaining the kind of principle is to think of a couple of examples, not from the UK courts, but in international courts, about where it has been established that climate is a relevant factor. And one very interesting case was from the Italian court in Florence. And it was a Pakistani victim of trafficking who was accepted as being kind of lower income in Pakistan and reliant on farming. He was a victim of trafficking, was brought to Italy. And in the context of his claim, the court was looking at whether he had a risk of re-trafficking if he returned to Pakistan because of his vulnerability as someone who was reliant on the land and degradation in his home area. And so it was that interlinking factor of a lack of livelihood, social instability, and being part of a marginalized group that led the court to say, well, actually, yes, you are at increased risk of re-trafficking, and therefore you have protection under the convention. Another case that maybe also gives a good illustration of how other factors in trafficking people who are marginalized, this gives us some additional points to think about how all factors interlink, was a case in New Zealand about an Eritrean elderly couple. And in the context of Eritrea, the court was looking at the lack of efforts made on the behalf of the government to protect older people, so more vulnerable people, with the effects of climate change leading to a lack of sustainable housing. And the court said, well, yes, this was a protection claim that came within the Refugee Convention, both because of climate impacting on age and vulnerability, but also because the Eritrean government hadn't put adequate measures in place to respond to all sections of the population in the context of a changing climate. And I hope those give you an idea as to how it's a range of different factors that can either increase vulnerability or can mean that people are impacted in a different way by the effects of climate. But as I say, that gives us examples of successes, but fair to say that quite a substantial number of people who are forced to cross an international border as a result of climate change may not fall inside those categories. And I don't want to deal with this in a lot of detail, but maybe just to give you a couple of reasons why. As you may all know, under the Refugee Convention, someone is entitled to protection if they have a well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds of either their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And what is required to make out a claim in that context is a kind of human agency of persecution. So think then to a community who's displaced by flooding, where there isn't human agency in terms of the natural, the disaster and event, but there can be human agency where, for example, that leads to inter-ethnic conflict, something for that example. But it becomes a slightly more complex assessment for the courts to make that says, well, this doesn't actually sound like a refugee claim at all. Another problem, I think, which is why the Refugee Convention and therefore international law doesn't necessarily help us, is the fact that the majority of countries employ a standard that if you are able to seek protection in your country of origin, you're not entitled to protection in another state. And that makes, because yes, it's correct, and we may come on to some examples of this, some countries uniformly are affected by climate change. One thinks about kind of small island nation type examples. But in other cases, that may be harder for people to establish that, that they couldn't reasonably move internally.